it's so nice to be with you, Carlos. And doing things like this helps my my body, mind, spirit. To be honest, just scrolling through the chat and seeing people from all over the world saying good morning and welcoming all of us here, it's a good feeling. So I'm trying to see the upside of what is obviously a very tragic situation, but the chance to do this, to connect with you and the other panelists and your YMCA leadership around the world is a great feeling. I'm also seeing the upside of spending more time with family. Carlos, you and I developed our friendship meeting each other at conferences all over the world. We were both very much on the travel circuit. And I have to say, I'm feeling pretty good about not traveling as much as I used to, and getting to spend more time with my young kids. I've got a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old. And so that is definitely maybe a blessing in part of this crisis. And, you know, my personal sport, we heard people talk about yoga and other things. I happen to have one that's very solitary, which is fishing. So I've been able a couple of times during this to get out to a forest in the middle of nowhere and do some fishing, and no chance of being next to people in that with that sport. So I'm fortunate to have that to keep myself on an even keel. So I'm doing okay, and just really thinking about those who aren't, because so many are not during this crisis. And that's really what we're focused on at Devex. You know, our community are the people who are on the front lines very often of this work, especially in the global South, and they are facing real challenges. So spending most of my time doing the only thing I know to do, which is get on the phone with leaders like the folks who are part of this panel today and hear from them about what they're working on, what they're hearing, what their take is. And I'm happy to share a little bit of that with all of you today, if you'd like.
Please, the floor is yours, Raj.
Yeah, so I've done dozens of conversations since this crisis has developed, and maybe I thought one thing I could contribute to our discussion today is just share what I've been hearing. And I guess part of what I've been hearing, this is from people who are, you know, leading epidemiologists, global health experts, people at places like the World Bank and the Gates Foundation and major international NGOs like those represented here. And I guess partly I'm hearing that a crisis like this accelerates trends that were already underway. So, you know, it really highlights and underscores those trends. And some of the big ones that I think are really applicable, including in advanced economies, including in the US and in Europe, are that people were already really more mobile than ever before in human history. People have been moving, right? And the changing climate is forcing people to move more than ever before this crisis. And that looks like it will continue to accelerate. Technology is making it more possible for people to move, including especially the move to 5G cell phone networks, which is coming very soon. So, you know, this kind of a conversation that we're having is still off limits to many people in the world who don't have connectivity, but it's increasingly becoming normal. So here we are in a crisis that's potentially causing a lot more mobility than ever before, but it's a trend that was already there. You know, we've been living more and more of our life online anyway. This is just going to accelerate that, and has certainly. People are living their lives more and more online, and the world has been becoming a much smaller place. You know, you and I, as I said, met each other through travel. People have been traveling more than ever in human history, and connecting through cultures and migration more than ever. So these things were going on already, but they've been underscored, and there are good sides and bad sides to them. You know, a really particular negative side to all of this mobility, this disruption in where people are and where they live, and the social distancing we're experiencing right now, is job loss. You know, jobs were already being lost through automation. But, you know, here we have this sudden shock to our system, and you're seeing dramatic job loss. And I know even at places like YMCA, that's really affecting you. It's affecting so much of our community. We've just put together a survey. The results are going to come out next week of our community. We have an audience of over 1 million global development professionals and aid workers around the world. And a very high percentage, about a third, worry that their organization you know, is really struggling through this, and a quarter think their organization might not survive it. So job loss is a really significant fear for many in the not-for-profit and philanthropic and development sectors. And I think that's a big, you know, when you see all this ability for people to move and change the way they work, there are upsides to that, certainly, but there could be a lot of people who are left behind as a result. And another negative when you think about the moving of our lives online is the potential for more and more social dislocation. You just had this great conversation with Cynthia I think it's really possible for people to feel more and more isolated than they have in the past as more of their lives are online. And we have to think about that, especially the most vulnerable populations, elderly people, young people. We really have to think about how are we in a new era where more of our lives might be online. How do we make sure we don't abandon those who need interaction and need engagement? And I think there's this idea that the world is becoming smaller has been happening for quite a long time now. And we've seen the rise of isolationism and protectionism in a lot of the world because of it. And that may only increase now because of a crisis like this. And so a lot of the experts I'm talking to are saying much of what we've already heard. They're saying, look, this is a crisis that's probably going to last a long time. It's not a few months. There might be shelter in place or lockdown orders in certain places in the world for only a few months that then get lifted. But this is a long-term challenge where you may see multiple waves of the virus coming back to countries like ours. It may move from one region to another. It may mutate. And so you're going to see a lot of this take a long-term form before there's really an excellent, highly efficacious cure or vaccines that can reach a large enough portion of the population or widespread testing. You're going to see a lot of dislocation. And I think we all need to prepare for that reality, that this is a long-term thing. And so those trends I talked to you about, they take on a different hue when you think about it as a long-term thing. When you think about job loss that could go on for a long period, maybe people don't come back to work or back to retail or back to businesses or back to places to work out or to congregate socially for long periods. What does that mean? When you think about a larger move to being online, what's that going to mean if that really becomes the way many of us do our work? And so the thing we're particularly concerned about at Devex, given the mission we have and the mission of the organizations we work with, is what is this going to mean for the most vulnerable people in the world? And you see in the U.S. that the social safety net, we knew it was thin. We knew our healthcare system had challenges. A crisis like this really exposes it. But think about some of the poorest countries in the world and what this might mean in places like that. So far, you're seeing a lot of great leadership in a lot of countries, including in sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of countries are doing a pretty remarkable job at social distancing, even when the costs there are far higher than in the advanced economies, because most people live in informal jobs. They have to leave their house to get food or to work. There really isn't a lot of choice. But yet a lot of countries are doing reasonably well at it. Even countries that don't have easy access to clean water, for example, they're trying to help people find ways to practice good hygiene during a pandemic like this. So there's good things happening, but we're really concerned that the conversation, especially here in the United States, where I sit, is very domestic and local. And we understand why. Of course, we're all facing this challenge, and it's not easy no matter your circumstance, but we need to start thinking more globally. This is a pandemic, and that means that we're only as strong as the weakest parts of our society globally. And so, thinking in those terms, we ought to be thinking, well, what happens when the numbers start to tick up significantly in parts of the world that really don't have the resources we do, or the health systems we do, where food security, as Jonathan and Barbara talked about, become a bigger issue, as you mentioned, Carlos. What do we do in those cases? And sadly, I think there's a lack of leadership today. And I'm hopeful YMCA can help to provide some of that leadership, because you're an institution that's been around a very long time and has a very strong mission and voice. And you reach so many people around the world. And I think being able to lift that up and say, this is a moment we need to think about the least among us. We need to think about the most vulnerable parts of society and to think big. This is a chance to do that. So far, we're not seeing a lot of big thinking. I mean, even when it just comes to money, we've seen very large, unprecedented aid packages in the United States, which I think are fantastic personally. I think they make a lot of sense to keep our economy going, but nothing comparative for the rest of the world. The amounts are very, very small, minuscule, in fact. And this is a chance maybe to say, why don't we have a new major fund for making sure every public health system in the world is at least at a minimum level, can at least do basic testing and contact tracing and quarantining, and again, that benefits the most advanced economies in the world too, because it'll mean we can control this outbreak everywhere. So this is the kind of thing that we've been covering at Devex, and we're very, very focused on, given that this is going to be a long range challenge. And my guess is while today most of the focus is domestic in places like Italy and Spain and the UK and the US, it will soon become a story of parts of the world that have the weakest health systems and that are the most fragile. And we all need to pull together. This is going to be one global pandemic. It's one world, and we need to pull together for each other. So maybe I'll pause there, Carlos, and see if there's anything you want to ask me or add. I can go on, but I know I'm sensitive about the clock as well.
Before we go to the question, can you talk a little bit about the future of the development world? Are we moving to development 2.0 or 3.0? How is your case about the next normal development agency and international organization? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think Barbara mentioned some of this in her comments. You know, I have a book that came out recently called The Business of Changing the World. And it's all about this idea that the global development sector, the aid sector, is going through a radical disruption and transformation, just like we've seen in so many other industries. And I think this crisis is just accelerating some of those trends. So, you know, a really big one is localization. You know, development used to be about Americans and Europeans getting on planes and flying to other parts of the world to provide advice and technical assistance. And increasingly, those resources, the talent, exists in a lot of the countries themselves. And we've learned that you really don't do real development unless countries develop themselves, communities develop themselves. And so I think there's more of a move now to doing that. And the survey we're putting out next week will show that a large percentage of development organizations are already seeing a shift to more rapid use of local national professionals, local national organizations, rather than importing expats, as has often been the practice in our field. I don't think there's going to be a complete immediate shift, but this is one big change that I think is going to happen more rapidly as a result of this crisis. Another one is around behavioral science as a main focus for how we work. So, you know, development was often a field led by economists. And so we would think about, you know, rich and poor as a resource problem. And increasingly we think about, you know, how do you interact with people, as customers, as partners, as neighbors? And we're seeing that especially with the idea of social distancing all over the world. That's a behavioral tool. And we had highlighted in an interview I did recently with an expert in this field that actually thinking about it as a behavioral tool means you might do some things that are a little bit different. And perhaps there's something in here for YMCA. The people that were surveyed by this organization that I interviewed said that they were more likely to social distance if they felt it was the norm, if they felt people in their community were doing it. They were more likely to wear a mask if they thought everyone else was wearing a mask. And they were more likely to take the risks seriously, even as young people, if they heard anecdotal stories from trusted resources that the risks really were bad, that even young people could get seriously injured and even killed by this virus. So there's a big opportunity. A lot of the noise out there today, a lot of what we consume in the media is from the least trusted sources. And the most trusted sources, groups like YMCA, may not be as prevalent in the conversation. And we can change that. And I think you as an organization pushing people on things like social distancing can really make a big difference in bending the curve of this virus.
There are two questions for Raj. The first one is the reality is that for the global south, development work is funded by organizations from the global north. Now everybody is hit. How do you see the future of this international funding, this business? And the second question is how do we maximize the potential of storytelling for positive social change in the face of the global challenge of fake news?
Yeah, good questions. I'd say on the first one, the short-term reality we're seeing is a lot of funders are pivoting to COVID response, right? So they're thinking about how do we take existing programs that we have, funding that might have been going to something that's in the health space, for example, and move that funding into something related to the pandemic response. And the reality of that is it's benefiting the largest international organizations, but it's doing that at the expense of a lot of smaller and mid-sized organizations. And the reason is many of those large organizations already have contracts or grant relationships in place. And so they can be you can easily pivot an existing relationship into some new work, sometimes without a bidding process, sometimes using emergency authorities to just change a project over. Also, sometimes when the funding agencies need to move fast, they prefer to work with a big organization that has scale. So in some ways, the bigger organizations are benefiting a bit from this. Local, national organizations in the countries where the work is happening, they're also benefiting because of the fact that you can't travel so easily now, and you absolutely need people who are more connected to the current context. So they're benefiting too, but there's a lot of concern when I speak to the mid-size and smaller not-for-profit and for-profit implementing organizations that feel that they will be squeezed as a result of this in the short run. In the long run, the bigger question is, well, what is this going to mean for development funding? Are we going to move to an era of greater isolationism in places like the US and the UK, where that puts pressure on what has been a nonpartisan issue of funding foreign assistance? And so will you see perhaps, tragically, it could come to pass that you'll see the pandemic growing in parts of the world that don't have the strongest health systems or the ability to socially distance. And so countries like the US say, well, we're not going to allow travel from those countries for extended periods of time. And as a result, that creates more fear and a sense, that, hey, we need to just take care of our own. We need to focus on our own people. And so let's not fund programs overseas. So there's a real question about, can we manage the transition during this crisis to a new narrative about global cooperation? Mm-hmm. And that would lead to greater leadership and maybe more funding. That might be the smart thing to do, it might be the right thing to do, but it's not necessarily politically the easy thing to do. Yesterday, I was in a video conversation like this with a Washington Post columnist, Michael Gerson, who is was a former senior official in the George W. Bush administration. And he talked about how this administration may not have the ideological tools, those are the words he used, ideological tools to kind of transition from this crisis to a global solution, to a global cooperation solution. But we need to find a way to get there. And I think institutions like the YMCA can help to be a platform for that, to see the longer term trend toward more global solidarity, especially on issues like health. One last quick point on this. We did a report in 2017 at Devex where we interviewed global health leaders, including Tony Fauci was one of the 40 people we interviewed. And we said, what are the biggest things we should worry about when it comes to global health security? And number one on that list, by far, nearly every person said the number one thing would be a global pandemic of a flu-like influenza virus. So this is it wasn't a shock to us. People who work in global health know that this could happen. And many say that there could be more of these in the future. So this is the moment really to say, like, let's not allow any country to have a health system that's too weak, where people can't get access to basic medical care. And still half of the people on earth today don't have access to basic essential medicine. So we need to find a way to use this crisis, as Jonathan said, as an opportunity to do something right for humanity. And that will affect the longer term funding questions. In terms of news, fake news and others, this is a moment when it's life or death, right? I mean, if people get the wrong news, as has happened, they've taken medicine they shouldn't take and they've died from it. So I think we're going to need to see societies confront this question of fake news in a more serious way than we have in the last couple of years. And that includes pushing global platforms to take these issues much more seriously, the big technology giants that are going to be huge beneficiaries of this reality, of this recession, of this shift to mobile work and the extended social distancing. It's really going to benefit the biggest technology players in the world, and we need them to be much more responsible on these questions around fake news and to be more of a partner. And then we're going to need to find trusted sources of information. YMCA is a great example, and to lift them up. So it's not just about pushing down the fake news, but lifting up trusted sources of information in the world. And we at Devex, as a news organization, take our credibility very, very seriously. But it's sometimes hard to break through with stories that are credible when there are sensational, sometimes fake stories out there that you're competing with. So it's not an easy one. I don't have a simple answer to it, but it has to be a project we're all engaged in together.
How do we see an increase or decrease the role for public health with an emphasis on the social determinant of health? Maybe if you want to answer,
Sorry,
you might ask him
I've got
to
a partner
answer the
here
question.
who wants to get involved in answering this question. Yeah, I think, and maybe I can weave this question into something broader about the role of the YMCA, coming out of this crisis, because, I think one thing we've really learned is that health is not just about medicine. And that's something certainly the YMCA has always known. This is an institution that's been around 175 years. And for the entire history of this institution, you focused on mind, body, and spirit. And you've thought about the holistic nature of health. And I think that's something we're realizing as we see that, certain communities are suffering more from this disease than others. And often it's related to social issues. It's related to diet. It's related to exercise. It's related to being marginalized in society. And we need to be thinking about really the whole person in the way that YMCA always has. So I think that's in a way, an opportunity. I was on a Zoom call with friends last night, and somebody there was talking about what they're doing about working out, going to gyms, which is very common practice here in the US, and talking about trying different online versions. My wife and I tried one of these online versions, and it's great because you get some exercise, but you lose the sense of community. You have this kind of fake sense of community. You're interfacing with somebody far away who you don't know, and you're not actually conducting a conversation with them. You're just watching a video. They try to make it seem real, but it's not. And I think YMCA has a big opportunity to think about changing its business model into the future. I know you're suffering now because of the model and the way your revenues get generated, but there may be an opportunity there in the future to bring together both the physical exercise with the mental well-being and the sense of community, to do that both in person and virtually. And I think the world's going to be looking for those kinds of answers as we come through this. So I'm really hopeful as we look to your 175-year history that many of those answers will come from you.
Right. What are your keywords you will leave us with?
Thanks. I'll just underline what I said, which is the world really needs YMCA. It always has. That's why you've been around this long. But it's institutions like this, it's movements like this that at a moment of crisis are needed more than ever. So really delighted to know you're out there and to know how committed you are to these issues, and really stand with you in everything you're doing.